Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating journey? Today we're plunging headfirst into chaos. Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It is, right? Now this book, it started as a simple magazine assignment.
Really?
Yeah, for Premiere Magazine. O'Neill was supposed to revisit the Manson murders, for the 30th anniversary. But as he dug in, he realized there was so much more to the story than just the helter-skelter motive.
Ah, the helter-skelter motive. That's where Manson supposedly wanted to start a race war, right?
Exactly. Through the murders, he thought he'd emerge as some kind of leader in the aftermath.
A leader in the apocalypse.
Exactly. But O'Neill starts seeing all these cracks in that narrative. Like Terry Melcher, the record producer, the guy who rejected Manson's music.
Right.
He claimed he had no idea about this whole helter-skelter thing until after the murders.
If Manson wanted to terrify him, wouldn't he have, made it clear?
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's also the fact that the police seem to overlook so much evidence that contradicted the helter-skelter theory. And then there's the question of how Manson, a seemingly low-level criminal, gained access to Hollywood's elite.
It all starts to sound a bit suspicious.
Right. And the more O'Neill digs, the more he starts to question the reliability of some key figures. Even Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor who put Manson behind bars.
Bugliosi, the guy who wrote Helter Skelter, the book about the case.
The one and only. O'Neill finds instances where Bugliosi's account doesn't quite line up.
Like what?
Well, take the pornographic videotape found at the crime scene. Bugliosi claimed he told detectives to return it to protect Sharon Tate's image.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but O'Neill discovered that Bugliosi wasn't even assigned to the case at that point.
Huh.
The timeline just doesn't add up.
So someone's not telling the whole truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just Bugliosi. Terry Melcher, remember him? He repeatedly denied meeting Manson after a certain date.
Right.
But interviews and official documents, they all contradict his claims.
So there's this pattern of, discrepancies and cover-ups.
It really starts to feel like someone, or maybe multiple someones, are trying to manipulate the narrative. And that leads us to one of the most intriguing parts of the book. O'Neill's discovery of these hidden connections between Manson and figures in law enforcement and intelligence.
Wait, what?
Yeah. It turns out Manson wasn't just some lone wolf operating in a vacuum. They're these shadowy figures who pop up, people like Reeve Whitson.
Who that?
Well, that's the thing. He's this mysterious character with suspected ties to the CIA. He played some role in cracking the case, but his involvement was kept very quiet.
Spooky.
Right. And then there's William Herman.
Okay.
He was part of a California task force monitoring student radicals. Now get this. This task force advocated for tactics that were eerily similar to those used by the FBI's COINTELPRO and the CIA's Operation CAOS.
Hold on, remind me what those were again.
Those were programs aimed at disrupting and discrediting leftist groups, often through really shady means.
So, are you saying that Manson might have been connected to these programs?
O'Neill doesn't say it outright, but he lays out the evidence and lets the reader connect the dots.
That is chilling.
It really makes you wonder, could Manson have been manipulated or even used by these powerful forces? Was there an attempt to steer the investigation away from certain truths?
It's like something out of a spy movie.
It is. And this is just scratching the surface. O'Neill takes us even deeper into the heart of the 1960s counterculture, particularly Manson's time in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district.
The hate, the epicenter of it all.
Exactly. Free love, social experimentation, LSD everywhere.
It was a wild time.
It was. And it's in this environment that O'Neill uncovers this controversial figure, Dr. Louis Jolyon West.
A doctor. What does a doctor have to do with all this?
West was a psychiatrist, but not just any psychiatrist. He was deeply involved with MKUltra.
MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program.
The very same. The one experimenting with LSD and all sorts of other techniques.
This is getting weirder and weirder.
And here's where it gets really creepy. O'Neill finds these striking parallels between West's research and Manson's methods of manipulating his followers. Both of them used LSD heavily. Both were masters of psychological manipulation.
Hold on. Are you suggesting that Manson might have been influenced by or even a subject of these MKUltra experiments?
Again, O'Neill presents the evidence, the connections, the coincidences, if you will, and lets the reader decide.
This is mind-blowing.
It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about the Manson case and about the dark side of the 1960s.
This is why I love this book.
Me too. It's like peeling back layers of an onion, and each layer is more unsettling than the last.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, that's what we're going to find out. Stay tuned, deep divers, because we're just getting started.
It's crazy how this whole investigation, it unfolds like a detective story, you know.
Oh, totally. Like
Whoa.
O'Neill's following these leads and uncovering these hidden connections.
Yeah, and then he hits these roadblocks.
And bam, wall of secrecy.
Exactly. And it's not just like law enforcement, you know, it's people from the counterculture too.
Yeah, you'd think they'd be all about transparency,
To
right?
think. But it seems like a lot of them just don't want to like revisit that part of their lives.
Maybe it's too painful, or
Yeah.
maybe it challenges the narrative they've built up about the 60s.
Yeah, maybe. But all that silence, all that secrecy, it just adds to the mystery, you know?
For sure. And it makes you wonder about, you know, the role of power and influence. Like, were certain truths deliberately buried to protect someone?
Ooh, good point. And you have to remember the historical context too. The 60s were like super intense.
Oh, absolutely. Cold War paranoia, social unrest, the government overreaching its authority.
And don't forget about all those covert programs like COINTELPRO and Operation Chaos.
Right. The FBI and the CIA spying on and disrupting groups they considered subversive.
And then there was Impultra, you know, the mind control experiments. It's all pretty disturbing.
It is. And when you think about how those programs might have intersected with Manson, well, it gets really unsettling.
For sure. It's like how much of what happened was truly organic and how much was manipulated.
Exactly. Now, O'Neill doesn't come out and say there was a grand conspiracy or anything,
Right.
but he presents a lot of evidence that raises some serious concerns. Like, a lot of Manson's associates, they had connections to law enforcement or intelligence.
Interesting.
Some of them even worked as informants for the police.
Wow.
And then there's that mysterious Reeve Whitson, the guy with the alleged CIA ties. He pops up and helps break the case. But no one really knows what his role was or why he was even there.
It's like every time O'Neill gets close to something big, there's another wall of secrecy. It's frustrating.
It is. But it also keeps you hooked. You want to know what's really going on. You know?
Absolutely. And, you know, we can't forget about the victims in all of this.
Right. The brutality of those murders, it really shocked the nation.
And the psychological scars, they run deep.
For sure. O'Neill doesn't dwell on the violence, but he does acknowledge the impact it had on the victims' families.
And their search for answers, it's really heartbreaking. They deserve to know the truth.
Absolutely.
Ah.
It makes you think about how justice isn't always served, especially when powerful people are involved.
And it makes you wonder if something like that could happen again.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because the parallels between what happened in the 60s and what's happening today, they're pretty striking.
Totally. Government surveillance, misinformation, the erosion of trust in institutions. It's like we're reliving history in a way.
It is. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from O'Neill's book. It's a reminder to be vigilant, to question the narratives we're given.
To think critically.
Yeah, exactly. History is rarely black and white.
Mm-hmm.
It's messy, it's complicated, and there are always multiple perspectives.
O'Neill's journey writing Chaos, it's really a testament to the importance of investigative journalism.
It is.
Yeah.
And it shows how much power there is in questioning the status quo.
Chaos is more than just a book about the Manson murders, you know. It's about this bigger search for truth.
Right. In a world where power and secrecy can easily obscure what really happened. It's a challenge to all of us to be more critical, more discerning, more demanding of transparency.
And it reminds us that even when things seem hopeless, that pursuit of truth, it's essential.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So deep divers, we're back, still wading through the murky waters of chaos.
And it feels like the deeper we go, the murkier it gets.
It really does. And you know what's interesting? O'Neill, he encounters this resistance not just from like law enforcement, but also from people who are part of the counterculture.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. Like, you'd think they'd be all about, you know, uncovering the truth.
Right. But it's like there's this unspoken agreement to kind of protect the legacy of the 60s.
Like, they don't want to admit that there was a dark side to it all.
Exactly. And that reluctance, it just adds to the mystery of it all, doesn't it?
Definitely. And it makes you wonder how much of history is like that, you know, sanitized and simplified to fit a certain narrative.
That's a good point. And that's what makes chaos so important, I think. It challenges us to be more critical, to question the stories we're told.
To dig deeper.
Exactly. And what O'Neill ultimately shows us is that the Manson murders, they weren't just some random act of violence.
Right. They were a product of their time.
A very specific time and place. The 60s, with all its upheaval and change.
The Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the rise of the counterculture, it was a powder keg.
It was. And Manson, he was like a spark that ignited it.
And don't forget about all the stuff going on behind the scenes, the government programs, the covert operations.
Oh, yeah. That whole shadow world that O'Neill uncovers, it's terrifying.
It is. And it makes you wonder, how much control did any of us really have back then?
Or now, for that matter.
Exactly. So Chaos, it's a challenging read, no doubt about it, but I think it's an essential one.
I agree. If you want to understand the 60s, the good, the bad, and the truly ugly, this is the book for you.
And it's a reminder that the past isn't as distant as we might think.
It's still shaping our present.
And that's why we got to keep asking questions, keep pushing for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Yeah.
So deep divers, if you're ready to take the plunge, you'll find a link to Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the secret history of the 60s in the episode description.
Pick up a copy, support the show, and join us next time for another deep dive into the unknown.
Until then, stay curious and keep questioning everything.